Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is The Devil and the Tiger Wildlife of Tasmania, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Matt Cornish. Thank you so much for being here today, Matt. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Brooke, and g'day everyone, and welcome to The Devil and the Tiger, the story of the Tasmanian wildlife. Before we dive into today's presentation, I completely understand and appreciate we have quite a few wildlife lovers amongst us. And as such, I just wanted to bring up this screen, this slide, and give a warning to those that are viewing today. The following presentation will contain images of deceased and sick animals. I have carefully selected these images to minimize any viewer distress. The images in question are designed for educational purposes, and I think they are an important part of the real life issues that are facing our Tasmanian wildlife or have previously faced our Tasmanian wildlife. I've got a beautiful picture here as our background. This is a wilderness area in the World Heritage Area of Tasmania, Cradle Mountain National Park. An absolutely stunning but harsh environment where both of the wildlife, both of the animals that I'll be discussing today, freely roamed prior to European arrival. If you do feel uncomfortable at any stage from the images today, I can appreciate and understand. If you do need to distance yourself or even just go to listening only mode rather than looking at the images. Again, I have carefully selected these images to minimize any distress, but please feel free to use your discretion. Today's presentation does revolve around two animals, two key icons of the Tasmanian wilderness. On the left-hand side, we have the Tasmanian tiger, also known as the thylacine. The reason we refer to it as the thylacine is, well, studies have shown that they weren't just isolated to Tasmania. We'll dive into that a little bit later. And then on the right-hand side, we have one of our most iconic, currently existing animals, the Tasmanian devil. Probably one of the most famous Australian animals, I dare say, thanks to Jack Warner and the Looney Tunes. Most people have heard of Tasmanian devil, the cartoon character. But this is a picture of a real life animal. I've introduced both of the animals that we'll be talking about today, but now it's time to introduce myself. I'm an Australian expedition leader. My name is Matt Cornish, and I live in an area called Far North Queensland. And you can see I've got a sneaky little selfie there in the exact same area where that Cradle Mountain National Park image was as well. Beautiful Tasmanian wilderness. I've been a Natural Habitat Adventures Australian expedition leader since 2023. I'm an Australian naturalist and I specialise as an Australian wildlife guide. I've been guiding in Australia for over 6 years now. My experience outside of guiding, I've had approximately 19 years now working with wildlife, from zookeeping to wildlife educating, as a nature photographer to a guide, and now as an expedition leader for Natural Habitat Adventures. For those of you who have not explored Australia, this is a map of our great nation, and you can see up the very, very top there, right near the top right-hand side, it says Cairns. That's where my webinar is broadcasting from this morning for me. It's currently 6 o'clock in the morning. But if we scroll our eyes all the way down the east coast of Australia, we get to a small island. But it's actually not too small at all. It is Australia's largest island called Tasmania, and one of the most glorious locations in our great continent. I refer to Tasmania as the land of 1,000 stories. It's a place of harsh wilderness, but also amazing wildlife. This place is just full of interesting stories, interesting people, and fascinating wildlife. And thankfully, it is a key component of two of our Natural Habitat Adventures Australian tours. It is part of our Australian South itinerary, and it's also part of our Ultimate Australia tour. Separated from the mainland approximately 10,000 years ago, this island has created change through isolation. Now, it's not only how long the island has been separated from the mainland of Australia, but it's at what pivotal time that it happened. We've obviously had glacial events throughout the world, most recently been around about 10,000 years ago. And with the water levels rising and falling, when they fell, Tasmania was part of the mainland continent of Australia. But approximately 10,000 years ago, it's separated by rising sea levels, and therefore it did keep animals in this isolated environment and free from any threats that arrived on the mainland. Tasmania was the last stronghold for the thylacine population, and it might still be. We'll discuss that controversial topic later. It is, though, the last isolated population for the Tasmanian devil. The first animal I want to dive into today as part of our webinar is the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger. Now, some of our viewers may never even heard of this animal before. And I guess the first thing to say is, unfortunately, this is one of our biggest failures in Australia by humankind. There is no doubt about it. But over time, the failure of this species has turned into an icon of change. This is one of the most iconic symbols of conservation management we have in the world, and not to mention Australia. And as you're going to see over the next few minutes, it is an absolutely fascinating animal, full of intrigue and also full of discovery and hope. Obviously, this is going to be our first distressing image. It is a man holding a deceased Tasmanian tiger. And unfortunately, this is how these animals came to the demise. They did naturally occur throughout Papua New Guinea, which is part of the island mass just north of Australia. They were found on the Australian mainland and Tasmania. Now, as the continents were connected, Tasmania was the first to separate. So, as the Australian landmass was connected to Papua New Guinea, Tasmania was the first to isolate itself. The Bass Strait is the sea body, the water body between the mainland of Australia and Tasmania. And once that started to increase in water level, Tasmania was isolated, but the mainland was still connected with Papua New Guinea. Now, we have dingoes in Australia. Again, a very, very famous land-based predator. Dingoes were introduced into Australia, and it's believed it was around about 5 to 6,000 years ago. And there's a lot of theories about how they were introduced. Potentially traded through indigenous people from Papua New Guinea to Australia, maybe as a hunting companion. Maybe they naturally traveled over by foot through the continental connection. But regardless, it's understood that when the dingoes arrived on the mainland of Australia, they directly outcompeted the thylacine as the main land-based predator. Now remember, Tasmania's already been separated, so the dingoes couldn't make it there. Tasmania remained as the last safe haven for this species, but unfortunately that was short-lived. During the 1800s and early 1900s, when European arrival was pushing through into Tasmania, Tasmania was a huge hub for European people. There was a clash between Indigenous Australians and the Europeans, and we have some absolutely horrendous humanity history in that area. But unfortunately, the wildlife wasn't spared either. In this era, the 1800s, early 1900s, private industry and the government introduced bounties for dead thylacines. During this time when the Europeans were establishing themselves in Tasmania and the mainland of Australia, they were really, a lot of people came over as convicts. And once their time as a convict came to an end, they were assimilated into society. And the best way to do that was teaching them agriculture and farming, trying to get them working on the land and contributing to the growth of the community. Now, unfortunately, number one, they probably weren't great or experienced farmers. So there may have been some issues there with the well-being of their animals. And the livestock at the time, the most popular one was sheep. And also, there was a lot of plants that were toxic to the sheep. So the sheep were dying through, well, poor farming practices, consumption of native vegetation that was toxic. And once they were deceased, Tasmanian tigers, the thylacine, and the Tasmanian devil, for that fact, would come in and consume the corpse of the sheep. It was easy pickings. These animals are apex predators of the land. Of course, they're going to take that opportunity. Sometimes the thylacine would be seen picking off a young sheep and consuming a lamb. And unfortunately, they were seen as the problem. They were seen as a speed bump in progression for these early European communities. And hence, bounties were introduced. I believe it was £1 for every adult Tasmanian tiger, every thylacine, and a couple of shillings for a pup. Now, unfortunately, back then that was a fair bit of money, so the motivation was very, very high. And these animals were hunted to near extinction. The last Tasmanian tiger, the last thylacine, was recorded alive at Hobart Zoo. And unfortunately, on the 7th of September in 1936, that animal was found deceased. Now, the story goes that this animal was kept in a cage with a rock bottom and a den. They would open the den up, the animal would go into the den at night and protect itself from the wilderness. Naturally, these animals would live in den structures throughout the wilderness of Tasmania. But unfortunately, one night, on the evening of the 6th of September, 1936, the den was not unlocked and open for that animal. It was exposed to the elements and was found deceased the next morning. The Australian government officially declared the species extinct in 1986. We have a process in Australia whereby we have to wait 50 years since the last individual was found deceased, it died. So in 1936, the last Tasmanian tiger that we are aware of was found deceased, but it was officially declared extinct in 1986. I find these images distressing myself, to be honest. They are quite heartbreaking to see such a beautiful and iconic animal just taken out by mankind. And this is nothing new. It's happening all over the world with different species. Tasmanian tiger is a very interesting animal. It's actually a marsupial, but it's a carnivorous marsupial. It's a hunter. So it has a pouch. It has undeveloped young, gives birth to undeveloped young, and it feeds those young milk. And because it's a hunter, unfortunately, humankind didn't look too well upon it. As I mentioned, the last thylacine was recorded alive in Hobart Zoo on the 7th of September and officially declared extinct 50 years later. Again, another very, very distressing image, but an image that we must learn from. And we're going to discuss why we need to learn from it. The date, 7th of September, is an incredibly important part of the Australian calendar. Now, this is something I haven't done before for a webinar, something a little bit new. I wanted to take an opportunity to watch a small video. Our last Tasmanian tiger, our last thylacine, was a female, and her name was Benjamin, actually. So there may have been some misinformation about her gender at the time. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to shrink my screen just a little bit, and I'm going to put on a video for everyone to watch. And I think this is an incredibly important video. Now that video is my apologies for that. It looks like it's jumped over to the next video. Um, but that video that we watched right there is incredibly distressing for so many different reasons. I mean, seeing an animal walking around on a rock concrete floor, seeing the chicken wire, that very, very thin wire holding it in, and the animal's clearly pacing, distressed. And it is old footage. It was filmed in the mid 1930s. It's been digitally remastered, but it's very jumpy and quite poor quality. But it can paint a picture of that last animal. And for most Australians who have an interest in wildlife and they see that, it is quite distressing and obviously an important reminder though of what has happened and we need to prevent from happening in the future. In 1996, the Threatened Species Network was founded by WWF Australia and the Australian government's Natural Heritage Trust, and they established this day to commemorate the death of the last Tasmanian tiger at Hobart Zoo. The 7th of September every year is National Threatened Species Day, and a day where we encourage every person in society, whether you have an interest in wildlife or not, to reflect upon what has happened in the past and what can happen in the future. And it's a day where we need to focus our attention on animals that are on that same trajectory as the thylacine. And I think that's why the thylacine's legacy is so important. Not only is it an error that we've made in the past, but it's an error we must learn from. And it's an error that we are continuing to learn from. National Threatened Species Day is also a day where different levels of government in Australia will project money into different conservation projects nationwide to help out our threatened species. And I think that's truly important. So, this is where the controversy begins. Is the tiger still out there? There's a lot of people in our communities of Tasmania and worldwide, in fact, that truly believe the Tasmanian tiger still exists. You think about it, we have a state island. One third of that island is harsh wilderness area. The western part of Tasmania has incredibly remote wilderness, but it's exposed to very, very harsh winds that come from the west, smash into the island. And as such, a lot of the flora that's growing in that area is very thick, unforgiving, and we even have an area called horizontal forest. And this is when the trees are so heavily exposed to the wind, they grow sideways. It's practically impenetrable. And a lot of people believe that the Tasmanian tiger is still living out there today. For me, I personally do not believe the Tasmanian tiger is still alive. There's a lot of people out there that have trail cameras and all sorts of different surveying technology to look for this species. And a lot of people still have the hope that they're still there. Now, it's interesting. The Australian Geographic was involved in a research project recently where some university students and lecturers sanitized all of the thylacine sightings since 1936 to now. Because a lot of people would see a Tasmanian tiger in the wild or think they did, they would describe the animal and report that sighting to the university, museum, or the government, and it was logged into a register because they were trying to prove that this animal wasn't extinct. Now, after sanitizing all of those sightings, they determined that the reliability of the sightings plummeted in the 1980s. Now, this is interesting because leading up to the 1980s, the sightings were very consistent and very reliable. A lot of sightings in one particular area, in a very, very close proximity, time wise and location wise. And a lot of them describe the animal perfectly. There's key features of the animal's body that a lot of people don't know about. The thylacine has a very, very firm, stiff tail. People were describing this animal that they saw as having a tail like a broomstick, very, very thick and stiff and straight. So after sanitizing that, we sort of determined that it's possible they may have still been out there until the 1980s, and perhaps they fell victim of narrow genetic diversity, and they did eventually become eliminated. Or maybe they are still out there. It's interesting because the Tasmanian tiger was found on the mainland of Australia as well. Some researchers have been surveying the mainland of Australia. In fact, only about 10 years ago, where I live in far north Queensland, the local university did a huge survey of a wilderness area in search of the Tasmanian tiger. How fascinating. I often wonder what evidence they received to be able to project that funding into that project. Must have been substantial. In the southern part of the mainland of Australia, there is a cave system. And an explorer in the 1960s actually found a deceased thylacine at the bottom of a cave. Its eyes and its tongue were intact. The decomposition was very minimal. He obviously contacted the local museum. They went out there, they collected the specimen, they carbon dated it, maybe 16,000 years or whatever. Now, if that's the case, then it's been perfectly preserved. But that cave diver in the 1960s wasn't satisfied. He went and collected a dead kangaroo that he found, and he put it in the cave, and he took detailed notes of the decomposition of the kangaroo. He noticed the eyes, the tongue, they disappeared quite quickly, and it decomposed very fast. So he thought to himself, well, if the kangaroo decomposed so quickly, maybe this Tasmanian tiger was a fresh death. Or maybe over time, the chemical compounds and the changes in the cave's atmosphere is adjusted and increased the decomposition. Who knows? And that's the mystery out there. There is some amazing books of some of those Tasmanian tiger hunters that are out there still in the wilderness of Tasmania trying to prove that this animal is still out there. But there's another approach that I don't look too well upon, and that is de-extinction. There is a couple of different organisations out there that are working together to bring back the Tasmanian tiger, and they believe with the specimens they have Tasmanian tiger fetuses, they've got embryos, they've got full DNA sequencing. They believe that they can bring back this animal. Now, for me, I grew up in the 90s watching Jurassic Park, and that was a horror movie. So straight away, I'm on the back foot when it comes to that kind of a process. But let's look at the moralities of that. And I truly believe this could be a podcast in itself, a webinar in itself, de-extinction. But when it comes to the Tasmanian tiger, we're really opening Pandora's box. We've learnt from the errors of our past. Well, I like to think we have. We have Threatened Species Day on the 7th of September. We're constantly focusing on protecting these animals that are on the threat of extinction, on the pathway of extinction. If we could simply bring an animal back, does that really water down the importance of an extinction? If the government is looking at mass land clearing and people are protesting to protect these threatened species that live there, does that still carry weight in the argument? Or are we just giving more power to authority to say, well, we have the genetic sequencing of this animal. It's fine. If it goes extinct, we'll bring it back. I feel like the de-extinction process is also a way that we move from being humans into almost like a godlike creature. And I don't think it's appropriate. But that, again, is a massive conversation that we could have in a different webinar. And I think that might be a great topic moving forward. It's time. It's time to speak about our next animal, the Tasmanian devil. And this little character right here is probably what most people think of when they hear of a Tasmanian devil. Look at the chompers on him. Those teeth are unbelievable. Unfortunately, this does not really depict what a Tasmanian devil looks like. But some interesting stories about this cartoon character. One of the theories is that he actually came from Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn, the actor back in the day, he actually, his father was a wildlife carer in Tasmania. So there's a connection between Errol Flynn and Tasmanian devils, and Errol Flynn worked very closely with Jack Warner. So it's understood that that connection from Jack Warner to Errol Flynn to Tasmanian devils is the reason this character came to be. And I believe there's some theories that Tasmanian devil is his actual personality is probably more Errol Flynn than the animal, but we won't go there. Ah, yes. Now that is a true Tasmanian devil. Some of these images, including this one, were taken by our photographic director, Mike Hillman, when he was leading tours around Southern Australia. He captured this absolute beautiful specimen. And this image was actually taken at a park called Devils at Cradle. We're going to have a talk about that a little bit later. But let's just appreciate the look of the creature. It's a fascinating animal. It's interesting, the name Tasmanian devil, early Europeans gave this title for a number of reasons. Number one, when the Tassie devil closed its mouth, its canines actually poke out from outside of the bottom jaw, so it protrudes, so it looks like vampire teeth. But also, those ears, they get quite red, and it resembles two red horns like a devil. And thirdly, the call of a Tasmanian devil is incredibly full on. It's incredibly intimidating, particularly if you heard it in the darkness of night. It sounds like a wild, wickedy screeching. It's quite intense. So all those three characteristics put together, and we've got the Tasmanian devil. Oh, that's a much better photo. It makes him look like a little bit of a puppy dog there, not as ferocious looking, but they are truly beautiful animals. Now, they only live in Tasmania, believed to be on the mainland roughly 500 years ago, which is quite phenomenal. I've tried to figure out why they were still on the mainland roughly 500 years ago. And I guess the best theory I can come down to is habitat loss naturally um, through the separation of Tasmania from the mainland and the climate changing and adjusting in that southern easterly mainland part. But also potentially the remaining population that did survive there were either outcompeted or eliminated by the dingo. But only up to 500 years ago, it's pretty crazy. And maybe genetic diversity had a part to play in that as well. Now, the Tasmanian devil is a scavenger. They have the jaw pressure of approximately 1,200 pounds per square inch, which is phenomenal, and actually gives it the record of the strongest bite for size out of any animal in the world. So out of size to bite ratio, this is the most powerful creature in the world. And they have to be because they're scavengers and they can crush through any bone matter of almost any animal. They can essentially crush through huge, big femur bones of a kangaroo. It's phenomenal. And they'll consume that bone matter. No troubles at all. Now, when the thylacine did exist, there would have been probably a little bit of a relationship between the two species. I would say the thylacine would be the hunter, and the devil would be the scavenger, cleaning up the scraps from behind. But unfortunately, this devil was wrongly accused of a lot of misdoings, and the government also subjected bounties for this species. Now, it is currently listed as endangered by the International Union of Conservation of Nature, so the IUCN lists it as endangered and decreasing in population. Now, I did look, and that was classified in 2008. So I am hoping, and we'll find out very shortly, that that is changing. They are still endangered and most likely will be for quite a while into the future. But I do feel like their population may be increasing in certain areas, and most certainly optimistic about it. Now, this is an image that no one wants to see, but it is an image that is incredibly important and an image that really must be remembered by anyone who travels to Australia or is traveling or is living in Australia. It is called DFTD, Devil Facial Tumor Disease. I think we don't need to look at that image for too long. It is powerful and confronting, but it is unfortunately the future of a lot of individual devils that are currently existing in Tasmania. It's a much better image on the left-hand side, a much more beautiful image. Shows the character of these animals. Again, another image captured by Mike Hillman, our photo director. These two devils are actually communicating. They're using body language to communicate to each other. They have interesting vocals, but also showing their teeth, opening their mouth. This is a communication technique. And generally, it's when food's around, they'll communicate and develop a hierarchy on who's going to get the first go. Yes, devil facial tumor disease. It was first detected in 1996 in the northeastern part of Tasmania before spreading throughout devil populations statewide. It was identified that it was a cancer. It was identified that it was transmitted by passing the actual tissue of the cancer from one devil to another. they found out that the cancer cells are actually living on the teeth and the face of the animal. So when they're communicating and growling at each other, there might be the odd bite here and there. And by doing so, they're passing the cancerous tissue onto the next devil, which in turn will develop those horrific wounds and tumors on the face. Once it's completely consumed the face, it prevents the animal from eating and leads to death. Now, the genetic diversity of the population of devils was so small because of those European bounties that the cancer was able to spread so successfully. It didn't have to mutate very much because all of the devils were quite closely related. So it bounced from host to host very, very quickly. So in a natural population, what would be just a mutation, a cancer that just develops, would probably die out due to genetic strength of the population. But when the genetic diversity is so narrow, that cancer just spread like wildfire. And that's unfortunately what's faced these animals. Before we discuss this slide, I have a bit of a personal connection with devil facial tumor disease. And when I run tours throughout Australia, I talk to my guests about this. And I grew up in the 1990s in Australia, and we have a TV program in Australia called 60 Minutes. I believe there's a similar program in America. And I remember, it's one of my earliest memories of on TV, there was a 60 Minutes program about devil facial tumor disease. And it talked about it, and my mum and dad were watching. I might have been maybe 10 years old. And it showed that the population of devils was going to plummet. And this was an animal that was going to go extinct. There was no two ways about it. And for me, I remember watching that program and my dad talking to me about it, saying, look, this is an animal that's probably going to go extinct. And unfortunately, this is what's happened from early European arrival and habitat loss. And unfortunately, Matt, this is probably an animal that we won't be able to see in the future. And I do remember being quite upset about that, knowing that this is an animal that it's currently out there, but we know it's going to go extinct. And it was quite distressing, particularly for a young kid who had a passion for wildlife. Over the last couple of years, guiding for natural habitat adventures and exploring Tasmania, I was fortunate enough to see my first wild Tasmanian devil, and it was a goosebump, tear-jerking moment. Looking back at those early memories of watching on TV, the trajectory of this species and the pending extinction, and then seeing this animal in the wild, and this animal did not have any evidence of facial tumor disease, was probably one of the most satisfying wildlife moments I've ever had in my life, and I will cherish for the rest of my days. And the reason I was able to see a wild Tasmanian devil is thanks to these four organisations on the screen. There is many other organisations out there doing great jobs, but these four are four that I've personally connected with and have seen the hands-on work that's being done. Bonorong Wildlife Sanctuary, Trowana Wildlife Sanctuary, Aussie Ark, and Devils at Cradle. Aussie Ark, they used to be known as Devil Ark, and you can see their logo there shows a couple of devils on the ark. As the name suggests, it's a safe haven. Their owner of the park, it's also known as the Australian Reptile Park, is a sister organisation owned by actually an American man called John Weigel. And John Weigel said, right, this species is going extinct. We need to do something about it. So he actually started captively breeding a population of wild devils and creating a huge, big safe haven for them in a light climate in New South Wales, an alpine country. And he started increasing the genetic diversity of this and said, this is the insurance population. If this animal goes extinct in Tasmania, we will have the genetic diversity and insurance numbers to release back into the wild. And that's what he did. It's now turned into Aussie Ark because he has a lot of different species that are also facing a terrible future. And he's decided to create insurance populations and research moving forward. Devils at Cradle are an organisation that we experience on the Ultimate Australia Tour and also the Southern Australia Tour. And they're an organisation that are focusing on maintaining that genetic diversity and also educating the public about the threats that are facing these animals. Bonorong Wildlife Sanctuary in Tarawana are doing the exact same thing. Maintain that genetic diversity, trading devils around Australia to keep that genetic strength alive, and also preparing for a worst case scenario. Now, there has been a development of a vaccine in the last couple of years, and trials are currently commencing through different organisations that are on your screen. And we do have optimism that it will result in a potential cure for these creatures. But those trials are still underway, and I don't have any further details about them. Now, not only have vaccine trials commenced, but there are very, very small signs of wild natural immunity popping up. So devils are being located that physically appear healthy, but are testing positive to the cancerous tumors. So it's showing that there is a natural immunity that is starting to pop up where they're catching it, but they're not affected by it. Now, this is incredible. Again, this is very, very preliminary research and surveys, so I don't have huge amount of detail to provide for that. But the genetic banks are strong, and I truly believe the devils will continue to smile into the future. And I love this photo. It shows the ears that I was trying to describe earlier. It shows the teeth and that dark character. An animal that is just truly fascinating. And an interesting fact as well is their sense of smell is just phenomenal. They can travel miles on the scent of a dead animal. It doesn't have to be a rotting animal, it's just even a fresh killed animal. As soon as they pick up that smell of blood or internal organ ruptures, they will smell it. They'll stand up on their back feet like a meerkat, smell it, and start heading in that direction. They can source their food from a very, very long way away, and they're incredibly powerful. They could drag a full-grown kangaroo carcass into the bushland to consume. No worries at all. Very, very powerful, strong, very, very successful creatures when human intervention is not a player. Another problem that's facing that we're trying to find out solutions for is roadkill. Other animals being struck by vehicles, the corpse is left on the road, a devil comes and consumes it, and a vehicle strikes the devil. So that's obviously another avenue we need to work on. In Tasmania, there's a lot of mitigation strategies they're developing for roadkill. They're putting up sensors on the side of roads, so when there's a car coming, those sensors send off a ping, which essentially distresses an animal to turn around and send it away from the road. So it's not the perfect solution, but it's certainly a solution that we're looking at developing and moving forward with. And thanks to Natural Habitat Adventures and their partnership with the World Wildlife Fund, this is you know, pivotal funding that's being injected into a lot of these organisations to ensure that these vaccine trials, the disruption of roadkill, the development of strong genetic banks, this is still happening. And again, it's thanks to Natural Habitat Adventures travelers and their willingness to explore for conservation that's leading to this funding and research. So out of all the people I should be thanking here, it's you at home listening and watching. Those that are traveling or have traveled with NatHab in the past and into the future are the ones that are saving these animals. And there's some amazing conservationists out there. So yeah, thank you to them and thank you to our listeners. Oh, the it's the very, very powerful images that thylacine. I feel like I have quite an emotional connection when I see these images of what has happened in the past and we must prevent from happening into the future. But this is the time where I want to hand it back to you, the listeners, the watchers. If you had any questions, please, if you haven't already submitted them, please submit them now, and we'll take a moment to receive those questions, and we'll take some time to answer them as well.
Wow, Matt, thank you. That was so incredible. You just gave us all so many facts about both species that didn't know before. So thank you for that. Everybody, we have quite a lot of time left. If you have any questions for Matt, I will be the moderator for you. We have quite a quiet audience. I think that we're all still absorbing all of the amazing stuff that you just gave to us. So I'll give people a little bit of time to submit some more questions here. We do have a request for a de-extinction webinar, by the way. Everybody, before we went live, Matt and I actually talked about this quite extensively in some big organizations right now that are tackling de-extinction and just the controversy around it. So I do agree it would be a very interesting, slightly controversial
Mm.
webinar to possibly tackle. So maybe Matt, you and I can talk about that a little bit with our expertise in the field. Awesome. All right, we have some good ones that have rolled in here. Could you actually talk a little bit more about the Tasmanian devil themselves from a biology standpoint? Are they
Mm.
marsupials as well, or are they just normal placental mammals? Yeah, could you talk a little
Mm.
bit more about them and about them?
Yeah, most certainly. And I apologize for not diving too much into that. But yes, they are a carnivorous marsupial. They actually belong to a family of animals called Dasyuridae. So very, very closely related to, again, the Tasmanian tiger. We have some other animals in Australia called quolls. So that's Quolls. Quolls. There's a few different species. Again, they belong to the Dasyuridae family. So they're a carnivorous marsupial. Quolls are probably more hunters, so they're predators, just like the thylacine was. The Tasmanian devil obviously is a scavenger. So they give birth to underdeveloped young. They make their way up to the teats and the pouch area. Now, interestingly, the Tasmanian devil can actually give birth to a lot. Like I'm talking, over 30 to 40 different young, tiny little undeveloped, almost like a jelly bean structure, and they crawl and make their way up to the teat. Once they lock onto the teat, there's only four teats. Once they've locked on, that's them done. They will then develop and grow. If you missed out on the teat, you're going to die. So it's interesting from an evolutionary point of view. It's got this constant every single year, this constant ability to wean out the weak and promote the strong. So this process of giving birth to huge amounts of young and only keeping four is a way that the species can continue to strengthen and evolve moving forward. Now, animals have evolved for a very, very long time and become highly successful in their niches. It's when we have sudden change, devil facial tumor disease, hunting bounties, road trauma. This is what's eliminating these animals because they don't have time to evolve. Interesting thing about the Dasyuridae family is they're quite commonly throughout the species, they have a very, very short lifespan. Some Dasyuridae can only live for around 18 months, which is crazy. But devils, you're looking at maybe 5, possibly even 6 years old. If it's in a captive situation, maybe that's 6. But in the wild, you're looking around 4 or 5 years of age. It's not very long at all. So they must successfully get with a partner, reproduce, and create offspring in that time period, which is phenomenal. So it's that very, very fast turnover. And that is beneficial for genetics. If you've got a consistent turnover of generations very, very quickly, that's when you can get that rapid evolutionary speed. But it comes with a weakness. And that is if you have a huge disruption to those generations and populations, you can lose a species very quickly. If you lose, let's say there's 2 years where the devils don't breed, their population literally plummets to, possible extinction levels. So you've got the fragility of that, but you've also got the benefit of a fast turnover of generations. Really, really interesting. I think an interesting thing about their communication style as well, and I always try my hardest not to embarrass myself in webinars, but I'm going to do it. When they communicate, it's like, yeah, it's a crazy squealing sound. It's intense. And obviously, that's the sound that the European explorers and colonists would have heard in the wilderness, and hence why they came up with the name the devil. But yeah, that communication is very intense. So when there's a piece of food, multiple devils may have come from different areas to that food. Once they get there, they have to develop a hierarchy. Right, who's going to get first goes on it? So they at each other, they flash their teeth, they stand up, they lock jaws sometimes and strike. And this is all part of that development of the hierarchy of who's going to get the first go at the best pieces of the meal, which is really fascinating. Um, so it's not so much an aggression thing, it's just a hierarchy development. And another way they communicate, which is really, really weird, and the first time I saw it, I couldn't believe it. They sneeze. And this sneezing, snorting sound is also a communication method between the devils. Um, I've seen one wild devil, as I was saying in the webinar, and I sat there in a vehicle, quite a few feet away from a piece of meat, a dead kangaroo that I found, and I had a thermal imaging scope, and I just watched. And after about 45 minutes, the devil rocked up, stood up on his back legs, lifted his head up, so he's smelling, and then all of a sudden, so he's communicating to other devils around, hey, I found the food, which is just unbelievable. And that devil actually grabbed the kangaroo and dragged it off into the bush out of sight. And for me, I was overly satisfied. But yeah, that's just a small description of Tasmanian devils and a little bit about their biology and behavior.
Incredible. And then from a predator relationship, going back in time, what were the Tasmanian tigers once a predator of the devils? Was it more of an apex predator
Mm.
mesopredator relationship, or did they were they in different niches, or how did that work?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. There's a lot of theories, and one of the theories is that no, the thylacine would not consume the devil, but the research that was being done when the thylacine was still in good numbers and a healthy population was very minuscule. So there's a lot about this animal that's on our screen that we just truly don't know enough about. But my suggestions and the research out there probably strengthens towards that the thylacine would take down the food, the devil would come in after the thylacine's left. Um, Generally, you're looking at a lot of the apex predators are probably avoiding other carnivorous animals and just focusing their attention on the prey. In Tasmania, they have very, very good populations of Tasmanian paddy melons, and it's quite a weird name if you've never heard the name paddy melon. So it's like a fruit, but the paddy melon is actually just a small macropod. So it's almost like a small wallaby, and they are in very good numbers. And still today, with habitat loss and road trauma, they're in probably even stronger numbers now today because the thylacine is gone. But also there's a Bennett's wallaby, which is like a small kangaroo. These are just the absolute perfect food sources for the Tasmanian tiger. So I dare say the challenge of trying to tackle a devil with the strongest bite to size ratio, and the fact that it's a carnivorous animal, it probably wouldn't have been on the menu. We'll just focus its attention on the delicious treats that were the paddy melon and the wallaby.
Ah, that makes sense. Sometimes it's good being small and vicious. Just like, I mean, we've all seen those videos of honey badgers, just going against all kinds of large predators. Nobody messes with them. So
Yeah.
sounds like a similar relationship. Oh, how fun. Oh, next, this is a really good one. So it sounds like the Tasmanian devil has gone through some pretty traumatic things in its history as well with cancerous disease and everything. Did they have a population crash as well? Did they almost go to extinction and then they were saved? Could you talk a little bit more about that story?
Yes, certainly. The Tasmanian devil, obviously, the facial tumor disease, is quite aggressive. It consumed the face of the animal, prevented it from eating, therefore it starved. Um, so we saw a rapid decline. The surveys out there for Tasmanian devils, the actual population numbers are very, very limited. As I said, the IUCN, the last time they surveyed, officially surveyed the species was in 2008. So we don't have really accurate numbers, but absolutely facial tumor disease, massive plummet in the population, straight towards extinction. And a lot of different organization conservationists put the handbrake on that, started, collecting some wild animals and also building the genetic insurance population in case that event occurred. But just at the last minute, starting to show that it's doing a U-turn before it gets to that cliff of extinction. Sorry for using so many different descriptive words, but it's just straight up turned around at the last second, and we're seeing that natural immunity come through when these organisations are ready to pull the trigger on potential vaccine introduction and insurance population. And there's a place in Tasmania, which is the place where I saw my only wild devils so far. And it's on the southeastern part of Tasmania called Tasman Peninsula. And this is a very, very small slither of landmass connected by a tiny little strip of land, but there's actually a channel through there now. And there's a bridge. So you drive across the bridge, across the channel, and you're on the Tasman Peninsula. Devil facial tumor disease has never been detected on the Tasman Peninsula. So their population is quite strong, and they've got huge quarantine procedures, like nothing of any form of wildlife can get across that bridge. So they've created this insurance population that's part of Tasmania. And that's why I went there, to look for one and spend some time in the bush, because I knew that that population was doing quite well. So there is certain areas that have had little strongholds here and there, little pockets where the geography has allowed it to be isolated, prevent that cancer from getting through. But on a whole, their population absolutely plummeted. Um, and all you have to do is speak to locals in the area. They would say that they would go out in the backyard and see 8 Tasmanian devils feeding on a carcass. And in recent years, they would say they'll go outside if they see a dead animal and there's nothing eating it, and then that dead animal just slowly disintegrates. And a lot of locals in Tasmania also use roadkill as a measure of devil populations. How long does the roadkill stay on the road? You know, Sometimes if an animal gets struck by a vehicle and dies, devil will come across in hours, remove it, consume it, or consume it on the roadway. Now we're seeing roadkill that's been on the road for weeks, sometimes even months. So that can be almost like a citizen science survey to suggest that their numbers are obviously still very, very low, but looking like they're going to start increasing again.
Yeah, so hopefully in our lifetime, it'll be a fantastic conservation success. Like we almost lost the species, but look, we've been able to bring them back through all these incredible things that you have mentioned that these conservationists are doing. I do have a lot of questions about de-extinction of the Tasmanian tiger. And it would be
Mm,
great if we could go in this a little bit further, if you wouldn't mind. I mean, it is a fascinating
mm,
topic and definitely a controversial one, both ways. Like, there's arguments that you and I were both talking about in both directions.
mm,
So could you actually
mm.
elaborate a little further? Like, how are these scientists going about this? Are there like surrogate species that they plan on trying to put embryos in, or how would they be reestablished if we even got to a point where they were bringing them back? So yeah, could you just maybe elaborate a little further on what you know about what the scientists are potentially trying to do with the de-extinction of Tasmanian tigers?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions I love to ask myself, but when it comes to de-extinction, the theory, and again, I'm not going to dive into this too deeply because it's quite a heavy topic, and I would need to do my own research to provide that really good in depth. But the theory is that they've created the genetic sequencing of the thylacine, and they plan on using a very, very similarly related dasyuridae. So remember carnivorous marsupial. It's this guy, his closest relative is an animal called the numbat. And the numbat's, about this big. So uh, there is theories that they're going to use a relative of the thylacine to develop the young and then create a pouch-like structure. But again, there's so many gaps in my knowledge of this process that I actually can't even get my head around how they would do it. But even then, if they have created the animal, do they? How are they going to get the genetic strength for it? Are these animals going to be able to reproduce on their own? Um, what are we doing here? And I think that's the question. I mean, when I was talking to you, Brooke, earlier about it, the question that I have is why? I think that's the big one. We're looking at this ability to potentially bring back a species. And, I think this is one of those conversations you really need a philosopher to dive into, of what the role of humanity is and whether that involves bringing back a species from extinction. Is that the appropriate thing to do? But from a scientific point of view, they believe they have the right process of creating the embryo using a surrogate species almost, which is closely related, and then creating a pouch-like structure to develop the young. But then what? If you've created a Tasmanian tiger, is it going to be exactly the same as this image? Not physically, but are we going to put it in a pen? Are people going to stand at the fence and look at it and say, wow, look what humans have done? Or are we going to be in a position where we can create enough diversity to have a population that's actually breeding and flourishing? And what would that cause to the environment that has now adjusted? There's so many crazy questions, but again, I do think it'd be an amazing webinar to do in the future. I think I'll probably need a month off to explore the topic in detail and put together a webinar, which I'm more than happy to do. But yeah, from a scientific standpoint, they believe they can do it with surrogate relatives. But then what? What next? That's the question that's on my mind all the time. What do we do once this animal has been created? There is definitely not enough genetic diversity to be able to create a population moving forward. That's my belief.
Yeah, and that was several sentiments of people watching that they threw that in the chat as well. It's like, okay, well, if you bring the species back, then what? And as you know, I'm a conservation biologist, as we were just talking, that's also my same question too. Then what? Like, then what? It's
Mm,
it's a big question. It's a big question, but there's some really big organizations that are tackling this question, and I don't know, maybe they might prove us fools. We'll see. I'm all game
mm,
for seeing what kind of interesting answers people are willing to try for these kinds of things, because you just never know. Maybe a breakthrough will happen that changes everything when it comes to extinction. We'll see. So many good. Oh, you brought up so many good things, Matt. I think we all have some research we need to do after this webinar to maybe go into the philosophy of de-extinction and come to our own opinions. But all right, I think that's now we are getting close to the top of the hour. So, Matt, I would love to turn it to you for any last closing comments.
I think I think we've dived into some pretty heavy topics over the last hour, and I've really appreciated the conversation. Um, I I love talking about this species, and I love seeing other people's ideas. And for me, I would love to be proved a fool when it comes to de-extinction and changes into the future. And for me, it would be nothing better than to see success. But obviously, there's a lot of philosophical and sort of value orientated questions that would have to be addressed into the future. But I guess from a beautiful point of view, from a positive point of view, I would love to see as many people explore and experience not only Australia but Tasmania. It is, as I said near the start of my webinar, is the land of 1,000 stories, and to see these animals and the work that's being done behind the scenes is so fulfilling. And again, I just echo my sentiments from earlier. I want to thank everyone who has traveled with NatHab, who continues to travel with NatHab, and therefore supports these organizations that are doing amazing things. I am not ashamed to admit, when I first saw my first Tasmanian devil in the wild, I was crying like a baby. I had goosebumps. It was such an emotional experience. Uh, and it's thanks to the amazing organizations and people who are choosing conservation exploration that I was able to have that moment. And so many other people are going to begin having those life-changing, life-altering moments. So thank you very much for joining today. Thank you for continuing to support conservation organizations throughout the world, including Tasmania. And I look forward to meeting all of you when you come and visit us in the land down under.
Absolutely, Matt. And thank you for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.